Latest episode of Better Humans at Work. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Deb Falzoi. Am I pronouncing your name right, Deb?
Yeah, yep.
Falzoi, excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Victoria.
Absolutely. So, a little bit about Deb. She believes that all employees deserve psychological safety for well being. I agree with that as well. She's built a base of more than 10,000 workplace anti bullying legislation supporters and has helped hundreds of abused employees understand their abuse situations, discover their self worth, and learn how to move on from their toxic work cultures. She's the executive director of End Workplace Abuse and co authored the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, which we'll talk more about here shortly. She's also been quoted in numerous media outlets, including Redbook, Forbes, Monster, and Truth Out. So we're so thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, workplace abuse, we have not broached this topic yet on the show. And so, before we even get into how you got into this work, how do you define workplace abuse for our audience?
I really define it as behaviors that create like a hostile, toxic work environment. So these can be
Mm,
things like um, false accusations, sabotage, verbal abuse, or repeated verbal abuse. We're not talking about someone just having a bad day. We're talking about actual behaviors that a reasonable person would um, feel as though they're in a hostile environment. And it's really become like an epidemic. So yeah.
the way, so the word that really stood out to me was the behaviors part. And the way I define inclusion are the behaviors that result in others feeling valued, respected, seen, and heard. So it's almost the opposite of that. It's the behaviors that make you feel excluded, that make you feel bullied, the term that we're using. So how did you get involved in this work? What is your background in this space? You've created a coalition. You're creating a movement. How did you get involved in this work?
I was actually bullied back in 2007. I worked at a university in Boston, and um, what I was seeing was just very blatant toxic behavior. There was an assistant dean who was psychologically abusive to a bunch of us. It was only women, and one of the problems that happened is when I went to report this behavior to the head dean, who was an interim dean in HR, and eventually the provost's office, nothing was done for months. I eventually left and found out that something was done maybe a couple months after I left, but this was maybe 8 months after I initially made the complaint. And so I was at a point in my career where I was like, this woman could derail my career. She could fire me for really unjust cause. Actually, after I made the complaint, she then made up a false accusation against me about like not following a procedure when that procedure didn't even exist. So it was really obvious that she was out to get me no matter what, whether there for a while I made sure that I crossed my T's and dotted my I's with everything. But when that wasn't even enough and she was still finding a way to get at me with just making things up, I was like, there's no winning in a situation or trying to feel safe when that's happening and when the employer themselves isn't going to step in. So at that point, I connected with a professor in Boston who had researched this issue for a while. And then eventually I wanted to create an organization where I could get behind some of the issues that I was seeing with the legislation, but also get behind like how we're getting to that, like the means, us supporting the means to the end that we're trying to get to. So I saw in this work like anti-abuse space a lot of abuse, a lot of replication of some toxic behaviors that I was seeing at work of gender discrimination, of racial discrimination, of being more of a top-down setup instead of trying to flatten the hierarchy. So um, in the last 3 years, went out and started my own organization. Um, it's an all volunteer organization at this point, but we have really made a lot of traction on it. So um, yeah, it kind of started with my own personal experience and being shocked that this wasn't an issue that was already addressed. That we have anti-discrimination law, but if you can't you know connect clearly the behavior to discriminatory intent, you don't really have much of a legal claim. So
Well, and if you're not one of the protected groups, right?
yeah,
And bullying applies to everyone, all groups, which is great. And you made a comment about like hierarchy and flattening the organization. Do you find that a lot of cases of workplace abuse happen from a higher ranking individual to lower ranking individuals? Is that common, or is it more like peer based, or is it kind of all over the place?
it's all over the place, but it is more common to have there like a reinforced hierarchy and a misuse of power within that.
Mhm.
Um, so, even though, and it could also be upward bullying. So it could be a subordinate bullying their boss. But most of what we see is that top down bullying. In fact, there's an expression that they say the fish rots from the head down, where
Mm.
we see that the person, the CEO or the president, sets the tone for the organization, and whatever they're tolerating, trickles down through the organization. So, and they also have a strong say in how HR is dealing with this or not dealing with this. So a
Mm.
lot of people go to HR thinking that they're there for the people when they're really there for management and protecting the company. So it really comes down to how the people at the top are, you know, setting the tone of the work environment.
And another parallel between your work and mine, I talk about allyship as using one's power, privilege, status, ranking to advocate for others and support others. And so it's another parallel of, but using that power, privilege, status, whatnot, to hurt others. Yeah. So what you do is so important. Tell me about the legislation work that y'all have been doing.
Yeah, so we the Workplace Psychological Safety Act is legislation set to prevent this behavior in the first place. So oftentimes what happens is when somebody deals with psychological abuse at work and they may or may start to notice that their health starts to deteriorate, they might have sleepless nights, anxiety, depression, and they go to their HR department and they um, I don't want to say quickly learn, but at some point they learn that their HR department is probably not going to do anything for them, and they start to feel trapped. It's often the high performers who are targeted. And so essentially, if you have one bad coworker or boss, they can derail your career. People have been pushed out of their industries.
Wow.
They could at least push you out of your job if they see you as a threat of liability. Um, and so we're trying to move that threat of liability from not doing something, or from doing something to not taking action. So right now, if you go to HR, they will more than likely have their legal department in their ear, seeing your complaint as a threat of liability and try to push you out. We want to move that threat of liability to not taking action, to not doing a proper investigation, doing it in a timely manner, sharing sharing the findings to some extent. I mean, if there are confidentiality pieces to this, but people want to see that there's action taken against abusive behavior. So we have that piece of it where right now the only way for people to go up against toxic behavior in the workplace is through anti-discrimination law, where you have to be a member of a protected class, and you have to, whether that's race, gender, religious background, all sorts of different protected class statuses. Um, if you are in one of those protected groups, you may have, some protections, and that's even debatable because that law has been watered down over the years to
Mm,
focus on discriminatory intent rather than impact. And we're
mm,
saying that if we look at the behaviors, even to an extent, regardless of impact, because sexual harassment law doesn't even require psychological injury, then you can have, we're trying to lower that baseline of a legal claim. And while we're saying that it would open up, to everybody can be subjected to psychological abuse at work, it's actually also strengthening protections for people in protected classes, because we know that there's a disproportionate harm against women, especially Black women, in the workplace, and so their protections would be stronger if we were to pass this bill. And then also, the employer would be required to take, you know, adequate steps to address this properly. So right now, they can, you know, they can claim that they're doing an investigation, and but really just drag it out, and their idea of an investigation could be either nothing, or like talking to the alleged perpetrator and the person making the complaint, and that's it. They could, I've heard of cases where they actually find bullying to take place, but because it's not unlawful, they don't have to do anything about it, and they've actually
wow.
said that. So we're saying that they have to, because no one's policing these employers, and they're policing themselves, and of course they're going to rig. If they don't care about their work culture, and especially how it affects their bottom line, they're going to um, have the findings come out in their favor. So we're trying to encourage employers to do the right thing and get on the side of prevention, so that we'll have safer workplaces. And if they don't do that, then they open themselves up to liability. So we've introduced this bill. It's gone through a bunch of iterations, but I think we finally have a really solid, concise bill. We've introduced it in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Hawaii, and like we have state teams in about half of the states across the U.S.
Wow.
But really some strong action happening in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, Washington D.C. Trying there, we're trying in New York City. We're trying on the city levels too. So really, I think this issue has been, people just don't talk about it that much. There's a lot of shame involved, or just a lot of workplace abuse or workplace bullying is not a household term. So when people are going through it, it's hard to, it can be hard to see the red flags, and also when you're being gaslighted and taught to kind of question your own narrative. There's there's a lot of self doubt and reasons to put blame on ourselves, rather than understand that this comes from not only the insecurity of the abuser, but also the system that reinforces these hierarchies around race, gender, and other factors. If you're not in the norm around, especially those two factors, then it's harder to have a voice and to be taken seriously, because people don't, you know, they they don't have to acknowledge your voice.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of layers to it, but we're definitely making a lot of traction and building a
It's
base.
amazing. It's amazing. Uh, so I have a question.
Yeah.
in the last corporate job I held, I had so much work, and I did not know it was my responsibility to push back and say, that's enough, I'm good. I completely burnt out at that job, like could not generate thoughts from my head. I was getting up earlier and earlier every morning because I have a hard stop at 5 to be with my son because I'm only with him for like 3 hours before he goes to bed. And
Mm.
so I would always stop at 5, but I'd make up for it by getting up at 7, then 6, then 5, then 4. And some nights I would wake up at 2. I would wake up at 2 to start my job.
Wow.
Now, no one was being mean to me. It was the culture. And as I said, I didn't advocate for myself. I didn't know I was supposed to. But you said something earlier about it's not intention, it's impact. Would that be a case of workplace bullying, or that's just a case of just overload and burnout?
There's some kind of gray areas. I personally think that if a boss is negligent with workload and they're not proactively checking in and making sure that you're um, having a manageable workload, I would personally consider that an abusive work environment. Like,
Mhm.
I believe that negligence can be um, just as toxic, if not more, as actual like proactive abusive behavior. When we think about like a parallel to parenting, neglectful behavior can often be the most damaging. So at the same time, there is I think I always think it's the boss's responsibility to to know what's going on with their employees. But if we have an opportunity to speak up and we're if we're not communicating certain things that would improve the environment, it's hard to put the responsibility on the person who's being overloaded and burnt out. But we do there are cases, in working on this legislation, there have been questions about like, well, what if the employer doesn't know that this is an issue? So it could, there can be cases where a boss doesn't realize something's happening and it's not being communicated, and therefore it's harder to kind of hold them accountable. But there are, in my opinion, situations where they should know and it's their responsibility to know. And if they're not doing something about it, they don't care about the work-life balance of their employees, then it's on them when their employees burn out and leave. I don't know. Um, I don't know if this bill passes, how some of these gray areas will work out with legal claims. I know that the courts tend to favor employers, and even with anti-discrimination law, there often needs to be like a smoking gun. And there's just, when we look at the past 60 years of that law, it really hasn't disrupted the hierarchies, and
Mm,
it's by design that that's happening. So it's going to be, even if it's going to be an uphill battle to pass a law, but once we do, it's going to be an uphill battle to um, have have wins for employees. So just because of how the legal system is working or not working. But
yeah.
yeah,
And as you said, there's a lot of gray areas. And I think it comes down to being a good manager and being a good colleague and being a good self advocate to help define where those gray areas are. Um, so, for those watching, what would be 3 recommendations, 3 pointers, Deb, that you would give to help ensure that workplace abuse doesn't continue?
I'd say from a boss or an employer's point of view, to like treat your employees like humans, how they're care about their well-being, care about see a report of abuse as um, helping the bottom line, as coming from somebody who cares about the organization rather than seeing them as a threat of liability. somebody who cares about the organization and wants to improve it. From an employee's point of view, I would trust your gut. A lot of people recommend documenting, and I think that that's great advice, if for no other reason but to, understand the patterns that are happening for yourself when you can easily start to question, is this toxic? Is it me? Is it, which is what a lot of people ask. When you start to document, you can easily see the patterns, or more easily see the patterns that are happening. And when you trust your gut that you're just not feeling valued, or, you're not feeling as strong as when you came into the job, or close to that, then you're likely working in a toxic work environment. If you can't feel heard, if you can't feel like you have control over your work, those might be some signs to, um, usually in toxic work environments, you can't speak up, but I would suggest, really doing some um, soul searching of like what you want in the long term out of your life, what you want to give to the world, and how you can get there, in a way that aligns with your own values. I think that understanding what your values are and surrounding yourself in all aspects of your life with people who align with those values is crucial to being happy, but also to heal from a toxic work environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for all that you do to help us be better humans at work. If people want to get in touch with you, Deb, how can they reach out?
The easiest way is to just go to endworkplaceabuse.com. If you want to email, it's info@endworkplaceabuse.com. There's a contact page on there too, but it's probably easy to remember, to just go to the URL and reach out.
Well, thank you for all the work you do. I'm going to continue to follow along. It's very aligned with, as I said, that I'm the inclusion piece. You're the exclusion piece, and between us both, when our forces combine, that's how we'll make a healthy workplace for everyone. So,
Yeah.
so thank you again for all you